So welcome, and if we can move to the next slide, please. We're delighted that you're joining us today. It's great in August when everybody's beginning to think about holiday or being on holiday. But this is a really important subject, and we're very pleased to have the opportunity to discuss this with you. Next slide, please. Today I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Mark Cumberlege and Alistair Stranack. One bringing the sustainability strategy perspective and the other coming from a search perspective. And our topic today is the Chief Sustainability Officer. If we move to the next slide, those of you who know Fidelio will be familiar with this model that we focus on the effectiveness of the board, the composition of the board, and the purpose, strategy and alignment of the board. And across all the areas that we work in, ESG has really become a main strand and very prominent in all our assignments. And to that end, the Chief Sustainability Officer is a role and a point of discussion that comes up again and again. If we move to the next slide, please. Now, you may be asking, this isn't a board role, and that's true, and the board isn't typically involved in the CSO appointment, but boards do care deeply. And, we're seeing this through our evaluations, but also through our search assignments as well. And some of the reasons will be obvious. Sustainability is a touch point for the board and for every one of the board committees. Very evidently, there's growing linkage between how the executive team are paid and compensated and sustainability. Increasingly, we're seeing that sustainability is a vital step on that pathway to the CEO role. And anybody who's sitting on a board will be thinking in a very structured way about what is greenwashing and how do we ensure that we don't inadvertently get into a situation that we as a company are in that position. So for all those reasons, we're seeing that the CSO has really moved up the board agenda and is on the board radar screen. Next slide, please. But before we move any further, I'd like to just sort of warm you up a little bit in this August and your feedback. We have two poll questions, and the first of our poll questions is, who does the Chief Sustainability Officer report to in your organisation? And we've got a number of choices: a CEO, CFO, Strategy Officer, HRD, Corporate Affairs Director, COO, GC, Group Head of Health and Safety, Head of Supply Chain, Other. So Amy, if we can just click onto the poll and let everybody answer the poll question, please. I think no, we can't vote, so our panellists restrain themselves, please. So, Amy, I wonder if you can let me know when everybody's voted, and then we'll take the results. Well, that's interesting. It's 54%, so actually over 50% report to the CEO, followed by the CFO, followed by the Corporate Affairs Director, the COO and the General Counsel, which is quite an interesting split and not entirely what I'd expected. I'm now going to move to the second question, which is, who should the Chief Sustainability Officer report to? So if we bear in mind that 54% and followed by 15% and then several 8%. So if I could ask, Amy, if we could open up the poll here and ask people to vote on who should the Chief Sustainability Officer report to. And again, Amy, if you're able to, when we have the voting in, if you can share it with us, please. Well, that's interesting. A strong vote in favour of the CEO, which I think is, you won't be surprised, I think we would concur with that. The CFO has been rather shortchanged. The Chief Strategy Officer has come right up the rankings. I think all of Alistair might want to say a word on that. and the COO. So I'm going to ask the team to capture that feedback. And let's move on, please, into the next chart. So today's webinar is designed to address some of the questions that you may have around this critical role, the Chief Sustainability Officer. We'll be looking at some of the origins of the role. Where do people come from? What's needed? What are the trends that we're seeing in the development of the role? How it's being shaped? And also a little bit of outlook. How is the role evolving? If we look to the next chart, without a doubt, a key driver of this role has been for many companies, net zero. And the train of reporting and regulation coming out of the Paris Agreement, the original Paris Accord, through to legislation passed in the UK, actually committing to net zero by 2050, and then flowing from that TCFD mandated reporting for the largest companies flowing through this year, and then also the requirement to state the pathway to net zero. All of that has undoubtedly created a requirement and also a sort perhaps an onus on companies, and we're seeing this as one of the main drivers for many companies setting up the role. But if we move to the next chart, it's by far, it's not the only driver. There are other companies where the S is really, really important. And, from the work we've done, and I think many of you have joined previous webinars that we've hosted, we've seen that even if companies are very, very focused on the E and net zero, to actually achieve net zero, there's significant cultural transformational change that's required. And so the E, the S and the G fit together very closely. And we think any Chief Sustainability Officer needs to be alert to this interconnectivity, even if the role is more narrowly defined. But on that point, let me hand over to my colleague, Alistair, who's going to take us through this concept of the linkage between strategy and the CSO role. Alistair, if I could hand over to you, please.
Sure. Thank you, Gillian. I just have a couple of slides really to try and put some of this in context. The first question to try and answer is, what is pushing companies now to think that they need a chief sustainability officer? And I think the kind of underlying issue is that, many people are quite confused or quite uncertain about what action to take to really address ESG issues. As we say, there's a lot about the environment, but there are many other issues that are involved in ESG. And so the CSO is a sort of solution, if you like, to this problem. And what we've found as we've talked to clients that we're working with in this area is that there are generally two tipping points. One of them is a reactive tipping point, and that's when they're finding that the expectations of stakeholders or investors are exceeding their ability to actually deliver on the kind of ESG agenda. And so they're effectively reacting to that and saying, let's put somebody in charge of this. The second type of company are companies actually who have worked hard on this area, and they've started to realize the importance of ESG in terms of their strategy going forward. So much more active thinking in terms of companies feeling there are real opportunities here, and we really need to engage somebody to really pull all this together. And the CSO role can make a real difference. Providing a kind of focal point for thinking around sustainability in generally working across the organization, because most of the activity that needs to go on does require a large engagement of a lot of the organization, and that's, as we'll see later on, is a very important part of the role of the CSO. So if we go to the next slide, then why does an organization need a CSO? And I think this depends a lot on where your organization is in what we think of as ESG maturity. And so if we're right at the bottom of this pyramid here, the real kind of key concern is around the regulation, the disclosure requirements. This is mainly companies effectively who are being pulled into this direction by investors and by regulators. And at that level, the role is really more just a head of sustainability or sustainability officer, really making sure that companies are providing the kind of information that's required in terms of disclosure. As companies mature, there tends to be a point at which they kind of realize that it's not just about reporting, it's really about understanding the kind of risk and the operational risk. And at this point, this is really where we start to see the Chief Sustainability Officer coming into their own, as somebody who can really understand the kind of operational details, really understand where risks are within the organization and the things that are required in order to deliver on their kind of ESG agenda. At the highest level of maturity, though, we start to see the emphasis focusing towards strategy, and particularly this identification of opportunity, rather than just thinking about risk and how to mitigate the ESG risk. Really thinking about new business models, like how the business can actually benefit from ESG in terms of improving its strategy and its competitive position. And so on the final slide here, in my section anyway, I just like to kind of pose the question, as to, is the Chief Sustainability Officer really emerging into the new Director of Strategy? If we think about it at ESCO level, the role of the CSO moves towards defining new business models for the company, thinking about addressing the need to deliver both financial returns and sustainability. Trying to work with our two kind of strands here, thinking of financial implications and of stakeholder engagement as being two intertwined parts of developing strategy, embedding ESG into the company strategy. And as I mentioned before, really starting to think much more about the opportunities there are from sustainability, as well as just thinking of the risks of the company. We start to see this in some of the stats coming through from companies, particularly, the majority now are clear that ESG is linked to company strategy. And around a third of companies are already seeing that sustainability opportunities are something which they feel they really should be reporting as part of their engagement with stakeholders. So this is one of the fastest growing areas that we see in our search practice. And so I'm going to hand over to Mark, who heads up the search practice, to really talk a little bit more about what the trends we're seeing in this area are. Mark.
Mark, you're on mute.
Thank you, Alistair. Firstly, I can confirm that Fidelio has seen a strong uptick in CSO appointments in our search and evaluation practice. And this is borne out by research from the Big Four. There's been an exponential increase in the number of CSOs being hired as organizations aim to integrate sustainability into the core strategy and operations. In 2021, more CSOs were hired than in the previous 5 years combined, according to a global survey by PwC. The seniority of the CSO is also increasing, with the CSO now positioned closer or on the executive committee. In 2016, 9% of CSOs were in the C-suite, and this has risen to 28% by 2021. And across Europe, a third of all large companies now have a CSO. Next slide. So the backgrounds. Just given how quickly the role is evolving, it is not surprising that CSOs come from a wide range of backgrounds. It's very common for the first CSO or sustainability appointment to be an internal appointment. Lateral hires increase as the role becomes more senior. Some of the more typical backgrounds for the CSO are shown on the chart, with some environmental experience being most common, followed by diversity of experience across consulting, strategy, and HSE. We certainly see that for the role to succeed, the CSO needs to understand the external dynamics of sustainability as well as the business and its key drivers. Therefore, it's interesting to see that 30% of CSOs combine a background of sustainability with strategy. This clearly helps the organization use sustainability to provide a competitive advantage. And those that combine strategy with sustainability are both more senior and paid more. Next slide, please. And here we see the key internal relationships. And in order to succeed, the CSO must be able to build strong internal relationships across the organization. And these include ExCo, the business heads, finance, communications, HR, and so on. And this is critical, as the CSO, arguably, more than any other role, delivers through and needs the support of the whole organization to be effective. And to quote from one FTSE 100 NED from their ESG report, said, once the chair and CEO are supportive, it is the finance function that has to come along for it to bear fruit. Next slide, please. And now we look at the key external relationships. The successful CSO must also be outward looking and will have a key role to play in engaging with stakeholders ranging from investors and rating agencies to regulators and NGOs. The CSO will contribute to building trust and developing the narrative with a view to securing access to capital, as well as ensuring the organization's license to operate. Key themes will include how the company will achieve its net zero targets, how executive compensation is linked to the ESG agenda, and delivering sustainability targets, to reassuring employees and prospective employees of the ESG commitment. Next slide. And here we look at reporting lines. And we started our webinar by asking you, who does the CSO role report to? And your answer was the CEO, which corresponds neatly to this slide. We are seeing here, too, an upward momentum in the role. The CSOs still have no one standard reporting line, but there is a clear trend to reporting to the CEO. In 2021, 1/3 of CSOs were reporting to the CEO, commensurate with it being the new strategy director. This direct line and positioning gives the CSO the required authority to deliver and influence change at the necessary pace, given the fast evolving demands of sustainability. Next slide, please. So what does the sustainability function look like? The CSO seldom has a large team. Rather, delivery is primarily through influence. And by having a small team, the greatest impact is through empowering those within the business. As we see below, the CSO creates champions who implement the new business models and processes. The CSO office will then gather the data, track its impact, and use this for reporting and as the basis to spread good practice, as well as provide comfort to stakeholders that the company is delivering on its targets. Next slide. So what are the key characteristics of a successful CSO? There is no one size that fits all, but there are some clear traits that enable CSOs to be effective in role. The ability to build trust with stakeholders, strong influencing skills, and the ability to deliver through others. A strategic vision for sustainability, an understanding of the business and its key drivers, a commercial mindset in order to identify financial and business opportunity. Next slide. And here we're looking at the scope of the role. As indicated, while the CSO role is likely to have a strong environmental component, there are typically multiple dimensions to this role, often connecting the E, the S, and the G. The CSO has the objective of building alignment to deliver on sustainability objectives and strategy. And in doing so, the CSO will need to be able to work across environmental issues, health and safety, supply chain, diversity and inclusion, manufacturing, conduct, and so on. So the CSO will add most value, not as a subject matter expert, but reporting or reporting or risk management, but in contributing to reconfiguring of the business model or maximize competitive advantage and sustainability. Next chart. So how do we hire for success? Given the rapidly evolving nature of the CSO role, it is important to have a clear and robust selection and appointment process. So be specific and take your time in defining the reporting lines and what the role is going to be responsible for. And ensure that the entire hiring committee is aligned. And don't be afraid to consult with the board and obtain their input. Be clear in articulating what is the experience you require, as well as the technical capabilities needed to execute those responsibilities. Also, what are the personal qualities you seek in a candidate? This will affect their ability to execute. They should support your culture and live your values. And critically, set out what you expect the role to deliver over 3 months, 6 months, and 12 months, and ensure that these are aligned and support your corporate objectives. With this level of detail and upfront thinking, you are managing both the candidates and the organization's expectations in order to achieve success in making this appointment. From our experience, and you can see here from our track record, by adopting this approach, we would expect the appointed candidate to remain in role for at least 3 years and significantly enhance diversity. This is particularly important for the CSO, as you'll want access to a diverse talent pool that can bring fresh thinking and leadership, and also the need for continuity to ensure the benefits of sustainability from both a resilience and a strategic perspective. Thank you. And now back to Gillian.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. And I think we can drop the charts just for the time being. I'm already getting a number of really very good questions from the floor, and would invite others, please use the Q&A function. And we'll now spend the remaining time just addressing some of those very specific questions. So the first question that's come up is a super question, and thank you very much. In my introduction, I sort of said in a rather offhand way that, of course, the CSO role is not on the board. And I've been picked up, why not? And really good question. So perhaps I could just kick off with that, because I was the one who made the comment, and then I'll invite Alistair and Mark to add any their point of view. But my thinking was, I mean, some former CSOs are moving onto the board, but it's largely in a non-executive capacity. The reason I probably didn't sort of make that link, you are seeing a CFO on a board, sometimes you see COOs on a board. It's not yet standard practice for the Chief Sustainability Officer to sit on ExCo, so that we would have almost missed out a step in that linkage. So I absolutely take the point, and I think it's a very valid discussion. But I think right now we're probably more likely to see CSOs moving into the boardroom via the non-executive route rather than the executive route. And I don't know, Alistair or Mark, if you have any additions to that or any further comments you'd like to make.
Yeah, I mean, just a point. We've been drawing the parallel between the role of the Chief Sustainability Officer and the Chief Strategy Officer, and it's still relatively rare actually to see the Chief Strategy Officer on the board. Normally, that's in the ExCo as well. So I think, as Gillian said, I think it's an evolving process, and I think we will see the capabilities going onto the board probably through non-executives, as you said, but it's still rare even to see Chief Strategy Officers on the board. So I think that follows your point.
Thank you. Mark, I now have a question for you, and I knew this question would come up. We talked a little bit about resource and compensation and the increasing seniority of the role. Are you able to give us any guidance on compensation for this role?
Yes, thank you, Gillian. I think we're seeing the CSO role, who sits on ExCo, typically with base salaries around about the 200 mark, going up and going up from there. Roles that are responsible for the sustainability role, but not necessarily a CSO on the executive, are typically in the region of 100 to 200.
So thank you, and I think I'm live now, and obviously that's in a UK context, but I think I should have said that a lot of our research has been global, and this is a phenomenon that we're seeing across different jurisdictions. I've got quite an interesting question, which I'd like to address to both Alistair and Mark, and the question is, to what extent has hiring or appointing a CSO had a positive impact on how attractive the company is or becomes to potential candidates, in particular graduates? Is this something that sort of people who are looking to join a company, will they be looking as to whether there is a CSO in place? If I can ask either Alistair, do you
Yeah, I think that's an extremely good question. And I think in general, like a lot of these sort of things in terms of signaling a company's culture and intention, appointing a CSO is a very important signal to the market, and particularly the recruitment market, that the company is serious about ESG and about what it stands for. So, I think, and I don't have sort of quantitative data about this, but I think it is another one of those signs that which will make a company much more attractive to graduates. We know that graduates look for a solid ESG policy. We know that they're looking towards sustainability and they're looking towards social policies. And I think this is just one of those signals that says, yes, the company really is serious about it. So I think it is a positive sign.
Thank you. I don't know, Mark, if there's anything you'd like to add on that point.
No, I think Alistair has said it, and I just reinforce the point. I think it's increasingly important for businesses to really make very clear their ESG credentials, particularly when hiring, and believe it or not, graduates, probably more than anybody else.
They're a critical audience, indeed. I've got another great question, and we're picking up on this theme, which is quite interesting, the sort of the CSO and the board. And the question is, how can CSOs best prepare to make the transition to NED roles? I don't know, Alistair, would you like to pick this one up? I've got a few thoughts to add, but I don't know if there's anything that you would like to say.
Yeah, I think that this is probably going to really be one for you. But I think that when we're setting out the characteristics required of CSO, I think the thing that came through that is it's as much to do with kind of experience at actually implementing some of these things within companies as it is towards the sort of specialty or the environmental specialty or whatever it is. And so I think, as part of the kind of net armor, one of the things that we're often looking for in non-executive directors is that kind of experience. Have they actually managed change in a company? Do they have experience of that, and can therefore be in a position to advise the executive well on what, how you really implement these sorts of changes. And so I think the role, as we're setting it out here, is a good setup for NEDs to join companies. But I think you probably have more experience of this one than I do, Jenny.
Thank you. And maybe just sort of a couple of thoughts on my side. I think it's a great question. One, sort of agreeing with Alistair, that I think any CSO, to succeed in the role, needs to demonstrate a broad understanding of the business, and not to be silent. And I think that will be one very obvious point. I think another point is connectivity with the board. Certainly sort of CSOs who are operating at ExCo level will have a lot of connection with the board and visibility of the board. And I think really using that interconnection, perhaps through an ESG committee as well, to really understand, but also engage with the board, I think is really very important. I do think the CSO is a naturally outward-looking role, as Mark illustrated, and that transition to the board is much easier for candidates who are well networked, who understand sort of ecosystems, etc. And then just as a general point, and Mark might want to add a little bit to this, we've recently worked on searches where we've been screening effectively for a minimum level of ESG. Well, obviously we would like more than a minimum level, but there needs to be a base level of ESG competence. Well, clearly for a chief sustainability officer, that's absolutely within their comfort area. So I think the world is probably slightly coming towards the CSO in this regard, in that all board members going forward will have to demonstrate an understanding of ESG. Mark, I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, just a couple of things, maybe. Just being a CSO in its own right is probably, from a board perspective, not in itself enough. So actually having a broad understanding of the business and the business environment is really important. So it's bringing more than just that the role and the function in its narrow sense. But also what the CSOs do bring, which is critical, is a real strong background to the ESG committee. And we do see more boards having an ESG committee. And this is a logical place for them to go and chair potentially as well. So that's what I'd have to add from that perspective.
Thank you. The questions are coming thick and fast, and another very good question, which I think is, I'm going to start with Alistair on this question. It's our thoughts on the appointment of a CSO and how to avoid that becoming an opportunity for everybody else in the organisation to dump all sustainability issues on the CSO, and kind of, it's not my responsibility, it's your responsibility. So if you flip that round in a positive sense, we talked a lot about working through and delivering through the organisation. I'm going to ask both of you to perhaps address that point. How does the chair, who's got an organisation that's just appointed a CSO, what can be done to ensure that that CSO really flourishes in the role and is able to work through influence and not just become the dumping ground for everybody else's sustainability problems? Alistair.
Yeah, and I think here this is really one of the roles of the CEO, to whom the CSO we think should generally report, and the chair, to ensure that this is clearly about a company drive to drive ESG through the organisation. The CSO is the mechanism that is being used, as I said at the beginning of my little bit, to because it provides a coordination or a sort of focal point for sustainability to be spread throughout the organization. And so I think it's really very much up to the CEO and the chair to ensure that the whole management structure understands that this is about spreading ESG across the organization, not providing a useful sort of dumping ground, as you say, under the Chief Sustainability Officer. So, one of the things that I think comes out in terms of one of the important facets of for a CSO to be successful is that relationship with the board and with the CEO, and that he is, that he or she is somebody who is actually engaged in ensuring that the strategy of the company is being carried out, is being driven through the organization, and is not, becoming sidelined to someone who picks up all the sustainability stuff. And I think that's a really, really important thing. Really, really good question as well.
Thank you. Mark, do you want to add to that?
No, I think Alistair said most of that, but as we showed on the slide with the relationship with the internal stakeholders, you are really working with that group of people. And we say it a lot, working with investor relations, working with communications, working with the COSEC, because actually responsibility for reporting, delivering is not just in one. It's not the sole responsibility of the CSO. It is right across the organization. So it is working with these people because the whole organization ought to be working towards integrating not only good financial returns, but presenting a sustainable organization, responsibility for all.
And I think, when making the appointment as a CEO, but also for the board to be cognizant of somebody who actually brings these skills and the communication and the leadership skills that are involved in achieving that aim. We still have some super questions. This is a question that has come up from a couple of people. We've talked about how quickly the role is developing and changing. And the question has come, how hard is it to find a good CSO at the moment? Is there not a major supply shortage, as in many other things in this world? Do we have an inflationary and supply chain problem with CSOs? Anyone for you?
Thank you, Julia. Yeah, I mean, this is how you position the role, first and foremost. So again, as I said right in my last slide, the clarity in the way that you set out this role in terms of exactly what you're looking for, what you're expecting from that role is really important, and how you put that candidate brief together will actually determine success. So yes, we accept there is a tight labour market, but actually good employers who really position their organisation well and know what they expect from this role will be able to attract good CSOs, and we are seeing that today.
Thank you. And another, I mentioned that a lot of the stats we were drawing on were international, not just for the UK. And we have the question, how are we seeing the CSO role developing across different sectors and across different geographies? And specific reference has been made to financial services versus other industries, and also UK, US, Europe. So Mark, do you want to kick off on that? And then perhaps Alistair would like to add. You're on mute, Mark.
We saw the title CSO actually emanate from America, and I think the US is somewhat further advanced in having more CSOs than any other region, but we're seeing Europe catch up pretty quickly in terms of the number of CSOs. I think, and this will develop, Asia's a bit further behind and Africa a bit further behind, but we are seeing the trend tick up pretty quickly. In terms of sectors, we're seeing actually now pretty much most sectors are got up to speed. As financial services, I think, are moving very quickly, albeit there is what is required from the role is not necessarily the same. And we're even seeing this inside organizations. I think no two role descriptions, if I'm being really frank here, are the same. They tend to be different and slanted in different ways. But nearly all organizations now have invested pretty heavily in this function, albeit at different levels, but across all sectors.
Thank you. Alistair, I don't know if you'd like to add to that.
No, I mean, I think that all makes sense. I mean, in terms of, we talk about financial services, and they're probably the highest profile in terms of, the sort of scope for kind of greenwashing and what they're doing. And so it's really the focus really is on the kind of scope 3 reporting type of issues. Where are your investments going? Are those really appropriate from a sustainability perspective? Interesting enough, in industries like natural resources, and also to some extent in engineering and manufacturing, the CSO role is often emerging from a environmental and health and safety type of thing, because many of those companies have got, particularly natural resources companies, have had environmental officers, in a very strong position within the business anyway, and so that's a natural evolution into this sort of broader CSO role. But yeah, and I would really just support Mark's perspective here, and from a strategic point of view, the role of the CSO and how it fits in, what are the material issues of ESG that the CSO role needs to concentrate on, is around the industry, the strategy of the company, and it's essential that those things are aligned. If they're not, the role will never get traction within the organization.
And perhaps one thing, just concurring with both my colleagues, for financial services, we've seen that the CSO role has quite a significant educational component, because I think in a lot of sectors like extractives or automotive, actually the environmental issues have been sort of the company's been aware of them for a long time and working on them for a long time. I think the reporting requirements relating to TCFD, etc., have really accelerated, and that's scope 3, have really accelerated the need for financial services to come up to speed. And we do see that sort of educational component being very important for financial services in particular. I've got another question which came in at the beginning, and I'd like to sort of circle back to it because it's a very good question. Do you think there's an argument that there should be no need for the CSO role, but that all boards and executives should be properly educated in ESG? And I must admit, we were discussing this ahead of the webinar, whether this, in an ideal world, will be a role that would sort of do away with itself because it would achieve its goals and therefore become redundant. But Alistair, do you want your thoughts on this?
Yeah, and if we go back to our model of the pyramid, I think what happens is that as the kind of maturity of ESG increases within a company, the roles towards the bottom of the pyramid become integrated into the everyday business. And so the CSO effectively is a mechanism for helping change each bit and then move up to the next stage. So, for example, all the kind of basic reporting and regulation, clearly that should be integrated within the average business and taken outside the CSO's role relatively quickly. If we look at the kind of second layer of the pyramid, which is really around operations and risk, that's probably where most CSOs are working now to change organizations in the way that they're thinking. But I agree with you then that over time that will become more and more part of the normal operation of a company. Everybody will be thinking about about those issues. And so then we move up to the kind of strategic role. And at that kind of strategic role, I think there probably is an ongoing role for the CSO. But as we've been hinting as we go through this, I think it just becomes an important part of strategy of the company, and therefore CSO and the Chief Strategy Officer, to our minds, I think over time will start to become one and the same role. And I think that will be an important ongoing role within an organization. But I don't disagree with the overall idea that part of the role of the CSO is to ensure that it is the education in ESG and the understanding of how sustainability needs to be integrated into every element of how a company operates. Part of that role is something that the CSO is going to be an educator in that, and then move on to other things as the company matures.
I think what the CSO is dealing with today should effectively be part and parcel of business as usual inside the organization. But we see new things emerging all the time. And I think the CSO is going to, the role is going to keep evolving and having to address different issues. I mean, it might be about water, waste, biodiversity, and so forth as we move forward. So I just think this role, as we look and try and pursue the circular economy, it's going to evolve and address new issues going forward. Whether or not it's actually called the CSO, we don't know, but I think some sort of role, as we're seeing today, will continue for a long, long time to come.
And I guess given, we did talk about it earlier, given the importance of the role in terms of access to capital and license to operate, there's a critical gateways, and I think the role will undoubtedly continue to be very important. I have a very specific, or more specific question. What kind of reporting relationship does the CSO have with the board and its committees? And I've got some thoughts on this, but I don't know if either Alistair or Mark. Alistair, any thoughts from your side about how you're seeing that sort of CSO connect with the board?
I mean, I think the most obvious, many companies now are setting them, the increasing number of companies are setting up ESG committees. And so there's an obvious sort of dotted line link there between the CSO and that committee. But even without an ESG committee, board committees have deal with issues that are very much associated with sustainability. And I think you mentioned it earlier on, Gillian, in terms of the remuneration committee and the impact on kind of executive remuneration that one deals with. To the extent that is evolving towards being driven to an extent by ESG, then there's an obvious route for a link there. But I think those are my kind of first thoughts on whether we have it.
Yes. Thank you. And I mean, we're certainly seeing that the CSO is very visible to the board, probably has a more regular reporting slot than many at that level of the organisation. And in many of the boards we're working with, the CSO will report to the board perhaps twice a year. And it's part of that sort of educational piece that we're seeing. And I think the other perhaps dynamic, which is quite an interesting one, our next webinar is actually going to be on the ESG committee and the chair of the ESG committee. And one of the things that we're seeing, I don't want to sort of steal the thunder from that webinar, but one of the things that we're seeing is there's certainly a sort of a sense that a broader background is beneficial to the committee rather than narrow sort of technical expertise in environmental issues. But there is a sort of the expectation that within the organisation at executive level, there'll be deep expertise. And so certainly, I know we've talked that the CSO is sort of rising up the organisation, but that relationship between the ESG committee and the CSO is a really important one. And it may well be that the CSO is bringing that sort of, real understanding of what's happening in the environmental space to a committee, which may not have that sort of detailed briefing and understanding. So I think, that's another dimension of this relationship, as well as, what we mentioned previously across REM, across risk, across NOM, because we are seeing that a lot of kind of executive committee appointments beyond the CSO also include a sort of a segment of sustainability experience. And so you're seeing the sort of the CSO really contribute quite broadly to the work of the board. I don't know, Mark, if there's anything you'd like to add on the relationship that you're seeing between the CSO and the board as opposed to the executive committee, which is what we perhaps dwelt on a little bit more in this webinar.
Yes, I mean, we are seeing CSOs report to the board, both to the audit committee and also to the ESG committee if such exists. So it's not uncommon to see the CSO present 4 times a year, something like that, to the board to update them in terms of where they are in TCFD or meeting their net zero targets, as this is a really important board topic at the moment. So it's not unsurprising that you would expect the CSO to report to them.
Thank you. And I've got another very specifically sort of search and appointments question. I guess the pitfalls. What are the pitfalls in making a CSO appointment? I mean, you've talked about kind of what works and how to do it, but what are some of the mistakes that perhaps companies are making, or you're seeing that kind of you're brought in perhaps to prevent them from making? Can you talk about the downsides and the dangers?
Sorry, is that to me, Julia? So, yeah. So some of the pitfalls. I mean, we've talked about this quite a lot. It's absolutely critical you have the support of the CEO. I think at the beginning, if you haven't got the support from the CEO, it's going to be a very, very difficult role to perform effectively. And also the board. So I think you do need that endorsement from the board, the CEO, and then widening that out. There are often, I've heard from CSOs saying there are going to be pockets of resistance or slightly more resistance in parts of the organization. I'm sure effective CSOs know how to deal with that by creating demonstrable areas of best practice and rolling that out, etc. But I think at the end of the day, if you haven't got the support of your CEO and the executive, it's going to be very difficult.
Thank you. I'd like to get to maybe one, possibly 2 more questions in. We talked about the educational aspect of this role. Alistair, I don't know if you can shed a light on how we see the CSO providing that sort of educational piece within the organisation.
We've talked about the CSO, I think, having operating through other people and through that. So almost sort of intrinsically, that role has to have a certain degree of education within it. But the CSO himself is unlikely to have a large organization to be able to do that. So I think it's really almost part of the thing. I think one of the earlier questions was talking about, over time, does the organization not just develop a greater understanding of ESG and therefore almost sort of like, works its way away from dependence on the CSO? And I think in a way that's part of the CSO's job to ensure that happens. So part of the remit really must be to go in, and make sure that within the operating units that there is sufficient education, that as the CSO is, sets things up for them, that they can move on themselves and start to develop themselves to deliver on the ESG agenda. So I think any successful CSO has to consider education of the organization as being an important part of their remit.
Thank you. And I mean, we're certainly seeing that education is in this area is very much in demand. I know on this webinar we have fellow members and board members of Chapter Zero, which plays an instrumental role in educating board members. And I would say that, we're also seeing within Fidelio that I think the most asked for module right now that we provide is climate change competence. And this is, so we're absolutely seeing, and I think the CSO is absolutely part of that delivery as well. And there's an overall upskilling, I think, which is going on across the top of organisations at executive and board level, which is really, really important and can't happen fast enough. So I think that's terrifically important. Now, I am going to just bring the webinar to a close. Could we just move to the charts at the end, please? We've just got a couple of charts to share with you to recap and look forward. There we go. So just wrapping up, and I know we've had a lot of questions, and thank you. There have been some really good and challenging questions, and thank you for picking me up, particularly on that first point about it, assuming that the CSO wasn't on the board. I think, you know, what I'd like to say is that the CSO is absolutely becoming a linchpin and holding both the board, the executive committee together in terms of how the company approaches sustainability. It's a unique role, and the ability to sort of work upwards, work downwards, work through influence is extremely important. As I mentioned at the beginning, certainly net zero is a major driver here. And I do think that sort of those reporting requirements that were in the sort of the first full year of the sort of the mandated TCFD requirements is linked to, you know, the fact that many organisations are reaching out for the first time for a CSO role. But it's not just about the environment. Even if your goal is primarily environmental, the S piece is really important, and the G piece is really important. And we are seeing that, you know, the CSO needs to have an understanding and an ability to link these different aspects of ESG. We've emphasised there's no one route, and I think that's good. We're seeing tremendous diversity of background into the role. A good talent pool exists, and it's increasing. I mean, if you look at people coming into the workforce now, a lot of them, you know, will have part of their training, part of their education will be about sustainability and development. So this is actually a growing pool, albeit perhaps to a slightly more junior level, but we are seeing a terrific upskilling taking place. And so there is a rich talent pool out there. And then the final point, coming back to that role to the board, certainly for CSOs who have operated at a senior level, who can demonstrate that they have a good understanding of the business, a good understanding of the financials, a good understanding of commercials, and a good understanding of sustainability. There is demand at board level, and we are seeing examples of sort of FTSE 100 CSOs moving into non-executive positions, which is probably in the short term the most common route, I think, to the boardroom, but that could well change. So I hope that's been a sort of a useful overview in terms of what we're seeing. Please do, if it's something that you'd like to explore further, whether you're a board member, an HRD or a CSO, please do get in touch. It's a space that we see that's tremendously important, and we're delighted to be helping companies that way. I'd like to also just look forward a little bit, and a couple of things that are coming up from Fidelio and the team. Firstly, next month, we'll be looking specifically at the ESG committee chair role. We've been really looking at this space and working with a number of companies, and we are seeing that this committee is rather like the CSO role. It's changing in shape, it's redefining itself, but it is becoming increasingly important. And it's also part of that sort of upskilling and educational role, as well as the role of just galvanizing organizations to deal with the big intractable issues that ESG represents. And we're also publishing this month, ESG and the board, What Works, looking both at committee and at the board more broadly. And we hope that you'll be interested in that report. We will absolutely extend invitations to you. So we hope to see you in a month's time. As I said, if we can be of support, don't hesitate to get in touch. We really appreciate your questions today, and we look forward to reconnecting. In the meantime, we hope you all enjoy a great summer and do manage to get away to wherever you're trying to get away to. But thank you all very much indeed, and thank you to my colleagues and the team as well. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.